At first, it sounds like kindness, a word carefully chosen to soften resistance, to quiet anger, to suggest relief without responsibility. Forgiveness. Student loan forgiveness. The phrase alone carries moral weight. It implies harm was done, that someone suffered unfairly, that a wrong must now be corrected. But beneath the comforting language lies a harder question, one rarely asked out loud. Who made the decision that created the debt in the first place? In a functioning society, choices matter. They create paths. They carry costs. And they demand accountability. But in modern America, something has changed. We increasingly separate decision-making from consequences. We praise choice, but remove its price. We celebrate freedom, while quietly transferring its burden to others. Student loan forgiveness did not emerge because the system suddenly became unjust. It emerged because the system was allowed to grow without restraint, without discipline, and without honesty. Universities raised tuition not because education improved, but because money became easier to borrow. Students borrowed not because they were deceived, but because they were assured the future would handle it. Politicians promised relief not because the system was broken, but because dependency is politically useful. And so a debt crisis was transformed into a moral drama. One side speaks of compassion, the other of fairness. But almost no one speaks of incentives. Thomas Sowell warned that the most dangerous policies are not those rooted in malice, but those rooted in sentimentality. Because sentimentality ignores systems. It ignores the quiet reality that every dollar forgiven must be paid by someone else. That every incentive removed today reshapes behavior tomorrow. That forgiveness, when detached from responsibility, does not heal a system. It corrodes it. This is not a story about cruel lenders or helpless students. It is a story about how good intentions, multiplied by bad incentives, can quietly undermine an entire generation's understanding of responsibility. Tonight, we are not asking whether student debt feels heavy. We are asking whether removing its weight actually fixes the floor, or simply weakens the structure beneath everyone standing on it. There was a time when borrowing for education was rare and risky. Students weighed cost against outcome. Families hesitated. Schools competed on value. Education was an investment, not an entitlement. That balance began to shift the moment government-backed student loans removed risk from the equation. When loans became guaranteed, lenders stopped asking hard questions. When lenders stopped asking questions, universities stopped restraining prices. And when prices rose, borrowing followed, naturally, predictably, inevitably. This was not a conspiracy. It was economics. Thomas Sowell often pointed out that when you subsidize demand without disciplining supply, prices rise. Always. Universities responded exactly as incentives demanded. They expanded administration. They invested in amenities, not instruction. They raised tuition, not because costs demanded it, but because students could borrow more. And students did borrow more. Not because they were foolish, but because the system told them risk had been removed. You'll earn more later. Degrees always pay off. Education is priceless. These were not lies, but they were half-truths. Because not all degrees produce equal value. Not all skills generate income. And not all debt is survivable. Yet the system made no distinction. A student studying engineering and a student studying an economically unviable field borrowed under the same assumptions, backed by the same guarantees, insulated from the same consequences. Debt became normalized. Not as a last resort, but as a rite of passage. And once debt is normalized, responsibility weakens. When failure is cushioned, risk-taking increases. When repayment is uncertain, borrowing accelerates. When accountability fades, prices explode. This is how a generation was trained to see debt not as a warning, but as a promise. And when that promise failed to materialize, outrage followed. But outrage, Sowell warned, is not evidence of injustice. It is often evidence of expectations built on false assumptions. Student debt did not suddenly become immoral. It became unsustainable. And unsustainable systems do not collapse quietly. They demand rescue. At its core, student loans were never meant to become a lifelong burden. They were designed as a bridge, temporary assistance to help young people acquire skills, increase productivity, and ultimately repay their debt through higher earnings. But over time, this bridge quietly transformed into a trap. To understand why, we must step away from political slogans and return to basic incentives, something Thomas Sowell consistently emphasizes. Policies do not exist in a vacuum. They change behavior. And when incentives are distorted, predictable consequences follow. In the early stages, government-backed student loans seemed compassionate and logical. College was becoming increasingly important in a modern economy, and many families lacked the upfront cash to pay tuition. By guaranteeing loans, the government lowered the immediate financial barrier to higher education. But here is the crucial mistake. When the government guarantees payment, it removes risk from lenders, and more importantly, from universities themselves. Once colleges knew that students could always borrow more, tuition no longer reflected what families could realistically afford. Prices rose steadily, year after year, far faster than inflation or wage growth. Administrative staff ballooned. Luxury dorms replaced modest housing. Entire bureaucracies emerged that had little to do with education itself. None of this happened by accident. When easy money flows into a system without corresponding accountability, costs expand to absorb it. This pattern appears again and again in economic history, from housing markets to healthcare, and student loans are no exception. Students, meanwhile, were encouraged to borrow under the promise that college always pays off. But this promise ignored a crucial truth. Not all degrees generate equal economic value. A degree in engineering or medicine is not economically equivalent to a degree with little market demand. Yet the loan system made no such distinction. As Sowell often argues, intentions are not outcomes. The intention was to expand opportunity. The outcome was a generation saddled with debt for credentials that do not reliably increase income. Worse still, many students entered college with little understanding of compound interest, repayment schedules, or opportunity costs. Teenagers, often encouraged by well-meaning adults, signed loan agreements that would shape their financial lives for decades. And once the debt was incurred, escape became difficult. Student loans are uniquely unforgiving. Unlike most forms of debt, they cannot be easily discharged through bankruptcy. This transforms what should be a calculated investment decision into something closer to indentured obligation. The system quietly shifted risk away from institutions and onto individuals, especially those least equipped to bear it. From Sowell's perspective, this is a classic example of policy failure driven by ignoring incentives. Universities faced no pressure to restrain costs. Students faced distorted signals about future earnings. Politicians faced incentives to expand access without confronting long-term consequences. The result was not accidental. It was inevitable. And now, years later, we are told that the solution to this problem is forgiveness. But before we ask whether forgiving student loans is moral or compassionate, we must ask a harder question. What created the crisis in the first place? Without answering that, any solution risks repeating the same mistake, only on a larger scale. Supporters of student loan forgiveness often frame their argument in moral terms. They speak of fairness, compassion, and relief. They argue that young people were misled, that tuition spiraled out of control, and that society benefits when debt burdens are lifted. At first glance, this argument appears humane, and in many ways, emotionally compelling. But Thomas Sowell warns us repeatedly. Moral intentions do not exempt policies from economic reality. Good intentions can still produce harmful outcomes, especially when they ignore trade-offs. The first hidden cost of loan forgiveness is not financial. It is moral hazard. When debts are forgiven retroactively, it sends a powerful signal to future borrowers. Consequences may be optional. If loans can be erased by political pressure, then borrowing becomes less risky, not more disciplined. This does not reduce debt. It encourages more of it. Future students may borrow even more aggressively, believing that relief will eventually arrive. Universities, observing this behavior, will have even less incentive to control costs. The cycle intensifies. The second cost is distributional fairness. Forgiveness is often portrayed as helping the poor, But data tells a more complex story. Many student loan holders are not low income for life. They are temporarily low income early in their careers. Over time, degree holders, on average, still earn more than non-degree holders. This means forgiveness often transfers resources from taxpayers who did not attend college, or who paid their loans responsibly, to those who did. Sowell frequently highlights this type of policy as an example of the unseen. The benefit is visible, relief for borrowers. The cost is hidden, millions of workers who receive no benefit, yet bear the financial burden. There is also a cultural cost. Forgiveness reframes personal obligation as collective responsibility. While this may feel compassionate, it subtly erodes the expectation that individuals must bear the consequences of their choices, even when those choices were difficult or imperfect. A society that repeatedly socializes losses while privatizing gains sends a dangerous message. Risk is encouraged, accountability is optional. None of this is to deny that many borrowers are struggling. The hardship is real. But Sowell would insist that acknowledging hardship does not absolve policymakers from examining cause and effect relationships. If forgiveness becomes policy, what behavior does it reward? What behavior does it punish? And who ultimately pays? Perhaps most critically, forgiveness treats the symptom, not the disease. It does nothing to reduce tuition. It does nothing to reform lending incentives. It does nothing to align education with labor market demand. In fact, it may make all of these problems worse. The moral appeal of forgiveness is powerful, but power does not equal wisdom. And policies driven primarily by moral outrage, rather than structural understanding, often produce outcomes that contradict their stated goals. One of the most misleading words in modern policy debates is free. Student loan forgiveness is often described as if debt simply vanishes, as though economic obligations dissolve through moral decree. But from an economic standpoint, debts do not disappear. They are transferred. The question is not whether the debt exists, but who pays it. From Sowell's analytical lens, this is where clarity replaces rhetoric. When the government forgives student loans, it does not eliminate the cost. It shifts the burden to taxpayers, present and future. This includes individuals who never attended college, those who worked through school, and those who sacrificed to repay their loans in full. This transfer raises a fundamental issue of equity. Why should a plumber, a factory worker, or a small business owner, who may earn less over a lifetime than a college graduate, be responsible for absorbing someone else's educational debt? Proponents often argue that society benefits from an educated population. But this justification ignores proportionality. Society also benefits from electricians, truck drivers, and caregivers, yet their training debts are rarely forgiven. Moreover, widespread forgiveness carries inflationary implications. When government absorbs massive liabilities, it must finance them through higher taxes, increased borrowing, or currency expansion. Each option carries long-term consequences. Higher taxes reduce disposable income. Increased borrowing shifts costs to future generations. Currency expansion erodes purchasing power. Again, the cost is real, even if it is delayed or obscured. Sowell consistently warns against policies that obscure costs because obscured costs face less resistance. When people cannot easily see what they are paying, policymakers face fewer constraints. There is also a political cost. Once forgiveness becomes normalized, it transforms education into a political bargaining chip. Debt relief becomes something promised, expanded, and repeated, especially during election cycles. This further disconnects education from economic discipline. And perhaps most damaging of all, forgiveness undermines the feedback mechanism that signals when a system is broken. High debt should prompt reform. It should force universities, lenders, and students to reconsider costs, value, and alternatives. Forgiveness silences that signal. It masks failure instead of correcting it. From Sowell's perspective, this is not compassion, it is avoidance. True reform would require difficult choices, limiting loan availability, tying funding to outcomes, and encouraging alternative paths such as vocational training and apprenticeships. These solutions are harder. They are less emotionally satisfying. But they address root causes rather than symptoms. And in economics, as in life, Ignoring root causes guarantees repetition of the same mistakes. Thomas Sowell often warned that the most dangerous policies are not the ones built on bad intentions, but the ones built on a shallow understanding of human behavior. Student loan forgiveness, in his framework, falls precisely into this category. At first glance, forgiving student debt appears compassionate. It promises relief. It offers a clean slate. It signals empathy toward young people struggling under financial pressure. But Sowell would insist that the real question is not how a policy feels in the moment, but how it reshapes incentives over time. Because incentives do not care about intentions. They care only about outcomes. When borrowers observe that large debts can be erased through political pressure, future behavior shifts immediately, even if silently. Students become more willing to borrow larger amounts. Universities become more willing to raise tuition. Lenders become less concerned with risk. And politicians become more tempted to repeat the cycle. This is not theory. It is pattern. Sowell often emphasized that people respond not to moral appeals, but to the structure of rewards and penalties embedded in a system. When the penalty for excessive borrowing disappears, borrowing increases. When institutions are insulated from the consequences of rising costs, those costs rise faster. Forgiveness does not remove the problem. It trains the system to produce more of it. Under this incentive structure, the student loan market stops behaving like a market at all. Prices lose their signaling function. Tuition no longer reflects value delivered, but access to subsidized credit. Degrees multiply. Credentials inflate. Outcomes stagnate. And yet, the political narrative remains focused on the borrower alone. Sowell would call this a classic case of concentrating benefits while dispersing costs. The benefit of forgiveness is immediate and visible to a specific group. The cost is delayed, diffused, and largely invisible, spread across taxpayers, future students, and the broader economy. This imbalance makes the policy politically attractive and economically dangerous. Another incentive distortion emerges at the cultural level. When debt is framed as something unjust rather than contractual, responsibility shifts away from individual choice. Borrowing becomes something done to people, rather than something chosen by them. The idea that decisions carry consequences erodes. Sowell was deeply skeptical of narratives that detach outcomes from choices. In his view, such narratives do not liberate people. They infantilize them. A society that repeatedly cancels consequences eventually loses the ability to teach prudence. There is also a quieter, more corrosive incentive effect: resentment. Forgiveness creates a moral hierarchy between those whose debts are erased and those who sacrifice to avoid them. The student who worked nights. The family who chose a cheaper school. The worker who never attended college but now helps pay for someone else's degree. These groups receive no relief. No recognition. Only a bill. Sowell often argued that social cohesion weakens when policies reward visibility rather than responsibility. Forgiveness elevates political leverage over discipline. It teaches that success comes not from foresight, but from lobbying power. And this lesson does not stay confined to student loans. Once learned, it spreads. If education debt can be forgiven, why not housing debt? Medical debt? Credit card debt? Each exception becomes a precedent. Each precedent becomes pressure. And each pressure brings the system closer to fiscal instability. Sowell would not frame this as a moral failing of borrowers. He would frame it as a predictable response to a misaligned system. People do what the system rewards them for doing. The tragedy is not that people respond to incentives. The tragedy is that policymakers pretend they won't. Forgiveness may feel like closure, but in Sowell's lens, it is not an ending. It is an opening. A signal sent to every future participant in the system that risk is optional and restraint is unnecessary. And once that signal is sent, it cannot be taken back. Thomas Sowell repeatedly argued that the most damaging effects of public policy are rarely immediate. They unfold gradually, quietly, and often invisibly, long after the applause has faded. Student loan forgiveness, when examined through this lens, reveals costs that extend far beyond budgets or balance sheets. The first cost is institutional decay. When universities are shielded from the consequences of their pricing decisions, They lose the incentive to control costs. Administrative layers expand. Non-essential programs multiply. Tuition rises not because education improves, but because the system can absorb higher prices without resistance. Forgiveness reinforces this pattern. It sends a clear message. No matter how high tuition climbs, the political system will step in to soften the blow. Universities learn that restraint is optional. Efficiency becomes irrelevant. Sowell would recognize this as a textbook example of removing feedback mechanisms. In functioning systems, feedback enforces discipline. Prices signal scarcity. Failure forces correction. Forgiveness interrupts this process. And when feedback disappears, dysfunction spreads. The second cost is cultural. Sowell believed culture matters more than policy. He warned that when societies normalize the idea that obligations can be erased through political pressure, they slowly undermine the ethic of responsibility that sustains complex economies. Student loans are not unique because they exist, but because they are contracts entered voluntarily. When the state retroactively alters those contracts, it teaches a dangerous lesson. Commitments are provisional. Promises depend on power. This lesson does not remain confined to education. It seeps into how people view work, savings, and long-term planning. If consequences can be deferred or transferred, prudence loses its value. Over time, this erodes trust, not just in institutions, but between individuals. The third cost is economic distortion. Forgiveness reallocates resources away from productive investment and toward consumption. Funds that could support infrastructure, innovation, or targeted aid are instead used to cancel existing obligations. This produces no new value. It merely redistributes losses. Sowell often emphasized opportunity cost, the unseen alternatives sacrificed by every choice. Forgiveness carries a massive opportunity cost, yet it is rarely discussed. What is not built? What is not funded? What is delayed? These absences do not trend on social media. But they matter. The fourth cost is intergenerational tension. Forgiveness pits generations against each other. Younger borrowers receive relief funded partly by older workers who never benefited from subsidized education. Future students inherit a more inflated system. Past borrowers receive nothing. Sowell warned that policies favoring visible groups at the expense of diffuse others generate resentment, not solidarity. Over time, this weakens social cohesion and fuels political polarization. What begins as compassion ends as division. Finally, there is the cost to truth. Forgiveness reframes a structural failure as a moral victory. It allows policymakers to avoid confronting the root causes of rising tuition, credential inflation, and labor market mismatch. Instead of fixing the system, they reset the scoreboard. Sowell would argue that this is not progress. It is postponement. Real reform would be painful. It would challenge universities. It would limit subsidies. It would force hard conversations about value, trade-offs, and expectations. Forgiveness bypasses all of that. And by doing so, it ensures the problem returns. Larger, more entrenched, and harder to solve. In Sowell's framework, the question is never whether a policy helps someone today. It is whether it builds a system that can sustain itself tomorrow. On that test, student loan forgiveness fails. If Thomas Sowell were asked to summarize the student loan forgiveness debate in a single sentence, it would not be a moral condemnation, nor a partisan slogan. It would be a warning. A warning that good intentions are not enough. A warning that feelings do not substitute for facts. A warning that policies must be judged by results, not rhetoric. In Sowell's worldview, student loan forgiveness represents a familiar pattern repeated throughout modern history. A policy designed to relieve visible pain while quietly deepening the underlying wound. He would not deny that student debt causes real hardship. He would not dismiss the anxiety of young people facing delayed independence, unstable finances, and uncertain futures. But he would insist that compassion, when detached from consequences, becomes something else entirely. It becomes indulgence. Forgiveness treats the symptom while preserving the disease. It erases the cost for current borrowers while leaving intact the incentives that created the crisis. Universities remain unaccountable. Tuition remains inflated. Credentials remain overvalued. And future students remain exposed to the same trap. Sowell would argue that a policy which must be repeated is not a solution. It is evidence of failure. True reform, in his framework, is never glamorous. It does not offer immediate relief. It rarely wins applause. But it works because it respects how systems actually function. That means restoring price signals. It means limiting subsidies that distort demand. It means forcing institutions to bear the consequences of their decisions. And it means telling uncomfortable truths about trade-offs. Forgiveness avoids all of this. It allows politicians to claim moral victory without structural change. It allows universities to continue expanding without accountability. And it allows society to postpone a reckoning that grows more expensive with time. Perhaps most importantly, Sowell would see forgiveness as a failure of intellectual honesty. It reframes a complex economic problem as a moral drama with heroes and villains. Borrowers become victims. Taxpayers become abstractions. Institutions disappear from scrutiny. And the public conversation collapses into emotion. Sowell spent his career resisting this kind of thinking. He believed that policies built on sentiment rather than analysis eventually harm the very people they claim to help. In the end, his verdict would be clear. A society cannot subsidize irresponsibility without discouraging responsibility. It cannot erase consequences without distorting behavior. And it cannot build prosperity by pretending costs do not exist. Student loan forgiveness may feel like mercy, but in Sowell's lens, it is mercy without wisdom. And mercy without wisdom is not justice. It is delay. And delay, when applied to structural failure, is one of the most expensive choices a society can make. The question, then, is not whether forgiveness is kind. The question is whether it makes the future better than the present. Sowell's answer would be no. And until that answer changes, the cycle will continue.